Okay, it is Sunday, the 31st of March, 11 o'clock in the morning. We moved to our typical Friday call to Sunday to do it on Sunday.
It was a hectic week. Everybody needed a little more time.
Yes. First part A, the ASU Charter. Any ideas or thoughts when you saw the charter video?
Um, I feel like the first thing obviously is like all inclusive. That's like one of the main overall goals of the charter, and just one of the points that they bring up is that um it's not to about what does it say? It's not about who they exclude, it's about who, how many people they can include. I'm trying to remember. I watched. Oh no! Ah, I'm trying to play the video. My bad. But yeah, that's one of the main things that I got from it.
Yeah, what I was really kind of caught up in with the video was Michael Crow was talking about his this increasing separation of society and how the starting point of children who of Rhodes Scholars was much different than those of lower socioeconomic classes.
Yeah.
So for me, that hit very, very close to home. Obviously my story was the multiple different schools, going from a school in an economically deprived neighborhood to finishing up my high school career in a upper middle class neighborhood, commuting into that neighborhood. I saw the support that was given to, the ACT was provided on campus. There was multiple mailings going home about the SAT and where to take it, versus in the schools in the more economically depressed neighborhoods, there was really nothing there. And just even class size ratios at the time were 40-1 in the economically depressed neighborhood and 25-1 in the upper middle class neighborhood. So for me, hearing this spirit of inclusion and everyone articulating the same thing really kind of, to me, goes towards Michael Crow's leadership in terms of trying to make it an inclusive environment.
Yeah. So it's kind of cool because you have the background. You've gotten to see both sides of the spectrum, like you just said. So you feel like what he's talking about, you feel like that's accurate, from your experience. And do you think that ASU, after reading the charter and listening to the video, do you think that they are doing what needs to be done to kind of even that out, or try to make it as inclusive and as fair as possible?
Yeah, just as in being in previous courses where there's quite a few Starbucks employees through part of that partnership with Starbucks and ASU, where Starbucks employees could take all the ASU online classes for free. I think that kind of the foundation of that partnership ties into what that shared vision was, because if they tried to be exclusionary, they wouldn't have put together that partnership with Starbucks.
Yeah, I think that partnership is awesome. I think that's a perfect opportunity for a lot of people, like you said, that wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what the video is saying, where it's like those who are ready are able to participate,
Mm-hmm.
and that they're able to attend college and graduate and find employment that will sustain them.
Yeah, and know that it's available for everybody and not just the students who, like he says, the kids with B averages who work really hard. Those kids, they need to have some, I don't know, they need to know that's there for them too, that college is not only just an opportunity for, the straight A valedictorian students. It's for a lot more than that. So.
Yeah, the video had mentioned finding a pathway across the spectrum, which I thought was a really good way of describing it.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm actually reading my notes here, and Kuz and Posner talked about where everyone on the team has principles that guide their actions, and as a leader, you must affirm the shared values of the group. And this is where the undercurrent theme of everyone, even when Alonzo Jones talked in the video about who to include and not to exclude, and then saying that ASU represents the world, kind of really started at the top where Michael Crow was talking about touring academia, and then looking at the assistant athletic director who's saying the same thing as his leader, really kind of shows, tying it into our readings, it kind of shows that establishment of that shared vision and purpose across the university.
Yeah, that's a good point. I agree with that. I think in the reading further down throughout the charter, they talked a lot about their goals to advance research and to be leaders in research, and they have super specific goals. That's like one of them was like, I can't remember exactly what it is, but they want to have like a leading, becoming the leading American Center for Discovery and Scholarship in the integrated social sciences and comprehensive arts and sciences. Like, I just feel like their goals are super specific, and they're pretty, like, I don't know, they have like deadlines. Like one of them was by 2025, we want to have this goal. So I thought with how much they're wanting to put a lot more money and time into research. It's one of their.
So if I could ask both of you, why did you select ASU to take classes? Laura, was there any particular reason why you selected ASU?
I had taken classes at ASU main campus and ASU West previously, but I did look at other online colleges before ASU. So I did want something that I was familiar with, and I'm friends with with a staff member that used to be an academic advisor. So that was kind of what sealed the deal for me, is that it was already something I was familiar with and knew what they were doing with their online program. So that was why I had selected ASU.
Yeah. For me, I did my first 2 years of college at community college close to home. And so then after that, I had taken, I was on campus obviously, but then I had started taking more and more online classes, and I was like, wow, I like the idea of online classes. I feel like it works for me. I feel like I'm going to class and I'm doing all the work at home still. I'm doing all the research and everything online anyway. And then when it was time to transfer to university, they had like, I think they would call them MAP programs, to where it was like you can transfer your stuff straight from community college, and you know exactly where all of your credits are going, and you know that your credits are going to actually be able to be used. And then I just feel like they had a lot of degree options online, and I don't know, it just kind of like felt right for me, like it was a good fit. So that's kind of how.
Same with myself. And where I was trying to go with this was talking about our dreams and aspirations for ASU, but my reason for picking ASU online is just schedule, and it's the same way I work, is anywhere, anytime, anyhow. And just the other day I was up the street at a place called Union Coffee on a video call for work, and someone asked me, how can you work at a coffee shop and still be productive and be effective? And it's really the same way that we consume information. It's on your phone, on your laptop, on the TV, anywhere, anytime. So why not study anywhere, anytime, and have that flexibility? But what about dreams and aspirations for the future of ASU? Any thoughts there? Anything that you would like to see ASU become?
I really liked when they were talking about the local impact, and I think that was, it seemed very relevant, and it seemed realistic to act locally and then expand from there, because they do have the visibility and, you know, the global aspirations that they're trying to reach. So I thought it was very inspiring, and for the university as well as for the students, you know, to see where you can make a difference first and expand from there. So I thought that that was a pretty cool part of the vision.
Yeah.
I like the part, one of their goals is to enhance the quality while reducing the cost of a degree. And I just feel like that goes right back into us talking about being all inclusive, you know, as much as they can make their degrees actually useful to people, you know, actually to where they can use it in their professional life and go on and have it help them throughout their life, while as much as they can reducing the cost, because that's just making it all the while more inclusive. So I really hope that they stick to that and really focus on that.
Yeah, when I reflect back to, you know, even as recent as 10 years ago with ASU as being in the news about a party school versus today showing up in world news and world report as, you know, number one in innovation. You know, that transition from then to now, it's remarkable. And like, to your point, I'd like to see more diversity in research, more diversity on campus, more different modalities for folks to be able to learn, you know, because especially that being a passion of mine, having more ability to learn and taking those and making them not just necessarily degrees, but transferable skills. Like, for example, I have this book sitting here on my desk, and it's not just, oh, look, I'm actually reading the material. I recommended that book 10 different times this week saying, hey, as a leader, you should probably take a look at this book, because going back to what you said about it being transferable skills and something that we could take away and employ immediately, there is so much stuff inside of that book that, you know, I kind of almost, it's almost replacing my Stephen Covey 7 Habits book, and really making it more of a leadership Bible.
Yeah.
And I think that goes back to Dr. Love and the way that he architected this class, and just as simply as reading in between the lines of Blue Latitudes, there's so many examples of leadership in between the quotes that, you know, the course was architected to make us think critically about leadership.
Yeah.
Speaking of thinking critically about leadership, what about SELMA?
That was intense. It was intense. I actually watched it with my mom while I was up north here, and we were both having like similar reactions. She was like covering her eyes at certain points because she just really had a hard time watching some of the scenes, and we were both getting really choked up and just horrified with how terrible people can be to each other. And they were talking about the march from Selma to Birmingham, and it was like 50 miles. So where I'm at, I was like, that would be like walking from our house to Sedona and back. I'm like, I have not wanted to, like, I can't think of anything within my lifetime where I would where I would embark on a walk where, one, it's a long way to travel, and you know, just the fear that something could happen. I mean, it's just the bravery of the people involved in this movement is just incredible. Just absolutely incredible.
So I'm curious about your mom's perspective here, because she was alive during that time and she was conscious and an adult around that time. Did she defer or reflect on anything that was happening on the ground at the time?
I did ask her like what her thoughts were about what was going on, or if she remembered seeing any kind of the news footage. And she said that she was in high school at that time. And so she said that it was on, but it was more in the background. And she was living just outside of the Detroit area, even when the Detroit riots were going on. And it wasn't like, she was aware that it was going on, but it wasn't like, there were so many other things going on with, you know, things heating up in Vietnam and the Kennedy assassination. It was just, everything was on and everything was intense. So she remembers it, but she doesn't remember, she doesn't remember necessarily all the details that were transpiring.
Yeah. And probably as a high schooler, I mean, you know, she wasn't a full, like, fully, like, I don't know, she wasn't really an adult, so she wasn't, I don't know, I feel like in high school, did I really know, you know, exactly what was going on all the time, and really, you know, you're just kind of in your own world, so
Yeah,
maybe
I'm motivated to be an activist.
yeah.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the context of the situation and the person's particular context, right? As a high school student, are you really that involved in social activities that are going on in society? And even race, even location. You know, I think if she were in Alabama or somewhere in the South, yeah, she'd probably be more connected to it, but being up in Michigan, not so much probably.
Well, and I'm curious to see what scenes you guys had wrote down to kind of highlight. I was like, when I was just watching the movie, I was just kind of making notes, and then sometimes I felt like some of the scenes were really big, and I tried to choose scenes that were a little bit not as pivotal, I think. So I was curious to see what you guys chose.
Yeah.
Yeah. So looking at this, what did I put here for scenes?
The worksheet this week is very like long and detailed, and I'm having to like look through. I'm getting lost.
And then on top of it, breakfast just showed up on my desk. So I actually put some different notes in mine. I was talking about how Reverend King talked about spent most of his time advocating and advocating with an audience with the president, and informing his followers on the challenges that were faced as a point back to what leadership was. And then his nonviolence approach, where he said, again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. So for me, that I tied it back into being seen as a direct influence from knowing your audience or knowing your followers, where they had the propensity for violence, but he pushed back and said, slow your roll. Let's meet them with soul force.
Yeah. I always think it's crazy, like it talks about like all, you know, it was a nonviolent, and like the control and the level-headedness that they had to have had, because seeing, you know, people being killed and being hurt, and with all this violence, and just being able to commit to their nonviolent, you know, their nonviolent protests, that I just think it always shows so much, you know, restraint, and so much just very humble. And I don't know, I just think it shows a lot of commitment to what they were trying to do. They were trying to prove a point, you know?
I think you're on mute, Laura.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, there you are.
Okay. I had made a note about when they were meeting, when they first get into Selma, and they're meeting at the woman's house, and she was making food for them, and they were all coming in. And I thought that kind of spoke to the shared vision, because, you know, the civil rights movement really depended on the grassroots movement and the people. And it was kind of cool to see that aspect of, you know, coming into their house and the person actually preparing food for them, and, you know, just the gratitude for what they were providing for the movement just by their hospitality. And like with the Montgomery boycotts, it was very similar with them. Since the buses were shut down, they were finding other transportation. And I think that goes a long way for the movement. So even though you have people that were at the forefront, you also had other people that were really contributing to the movement with everyday actions.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about the house scene was there were folks in that same house who didn't know each other, and it was their first time meeting each other. And that goes back to that grassroots approach of, hey, we're all going to meet at her house and we're all going to have breakfast, and that's where we're going to grab some of the key leaders of the movement in a single place, in a single spot. So the coordination and the vision to be able to both have something over or talk about or experience something over something as simple as a meal, getting everyone together for a meal to talk about vision, it's also a very effective way how to establish that bond, even though they knew each other. Like myself, whenever I'm leading my team and we need to figure out something, let's go off campus, let's go to lunch, let's go talk about it over a bite to eat. It's much easier to get everyone on the same page when you take them out of their normal, typical environment, because the guard tends to drop a little bit, especially over grids.
Yeah. One of the scenes that stood out to me was where they have just done. Well, it's actually where the police come into the restaurant, and they beat up and then they shoot Jimmy Lee Jackson to kind of silence them after the night march. It's really hard to watch, and just kind of, as you said, Laura, it's like one of those parts that you just want to like cover your eyes and be like, no. I think it just gives a lot of perspective of, I can't believe this was actually happening, and this is the way people are actually treating each other. And then, so it was shocking, obviously, to watch. And then it just makes you realize how, I don't know, just how unfair it can be. And nothing was being done about it. It's just in a restaurant in the middle of, people are just there and nobody can do anything about it, basically. And then I think it just shows that, how many people really had to suffer for this, and how many, people gave up a lot. And then right after that, he goes and he talks to his father, and I think that part is just super, it's just one of those, I don't know, intense parts, and he tells them, there are no words to soothe you. I don't know even what to say, and then he says something like, God was to cry for your boy, or something like that. And it's just like, I don't know. It just shows, I think that just shows like the loss that he suffered was so extreme, and it was, I don't know. It was a lot for that.
Here's a question for you, and I'm going to play a little bit devil's advocate for a second. Do you think that Martin Luther King was responsible for Jimmy Lee's death?
I think that is what, so skipping to like later on when it's talking about what were the tactics that they would try to use against them, I think that's one of the tactics is they would try to blame. The one part they say, this is what you wanted, you were provoking it, and you wanted, somebody to get killed, so then you had something to say, and this is, you're trying to basically throw a pity party is what they're trying to use against them to bring them down. So I would say no. No, it's not.
What about you, Laura? Do you think the Reverend Martin Luther King was responsible for Jimmy Lee's death?
No, I don't think he has his blood on his hands. From the movie's representation, they waited until King was out of town. They waited until, it was an unofficial march. It was like they totally exploited the situation. And not only were they, it wasn't just about breaking up the march, because they were, You know, they went in and they were, you know, beating everybody up in the streets. But it wasn't just that. They were pursuing these people even after they dispersed. They were chasing them down alleys. They were chasing them to the restaurants. So I think that if I don't think it's proper to put those lives lost on MLK, especially when they were showing up to represent their involvement in the movement for what they were wanting.
What I wrote, and the reason why I asked it the way I asked it was, what I wrote in here was the end justifies the means in this scenario. King had to be flexible along the way, understanding the most optimum time to influence and to demonstrate, but he also had the innate ability to know when to take his foot off the accelerator. One time was the second time when they were planning across the bridge, when the general called for the troops to step aside. Remember when King and all the marchers took a knee and prayed? And later on they referred to it as he was getting a message from God on what to do with his actions. But he was also heavily criticized for not moving forward. But to him, he felt that they were going to be put at a very, very large disadvantage because being blocked from behind, supply routes being cut off, wouldn't be able to continue to march, and they would be sitting ducks in some of those extra outside of SELMA territories. It was allowing him to take some strategic thought and mix it with tactical foresight, right? So he thought ahead in the future. So, you know, going back in time, back to our book, envisioning the future, what could happen and what the potential is, and making the decision to not put others in harm's way was because of his ability to envision the future. What did I put for the scenes here? The clergyman from Boston who was killed. I saw that as a turning point where everyone, even whites and even more followers, were appealing more towards the authenticity of the approach versus it just being a black problem or it just being a right to vote problem. The death of that Boston clergyman opened it up to every single living room in terms of, hey, this is an American problem. I think is what LBJ said was, this is an American problem, therefore we're going to fix it as Americans.
Yeah. Do you think that got more people? I mean, when that happened, do you think that made everybody realize that in that moment, or you know, more people to, wow, this is, like you said, this is not just a black issue. It's not just a right to vote. It involves everybody.
Yeah, I think it turned it from one type of issue to a broader issue of violence in the South and the ideologies that were deeply rooted, even with the governor. The governor was George Wallace, and George Wallace was very reticent to do anything about it. But I think when the Boston clergyman was murdered and being treated like a Negro in the eyes of the assailants, I think that kind of took everything and just flipped the script, so to speak, and made it real for every living room across America, thus putting pressure on LBJ to push the bill through through Congress. So what other areas stood out? What about the difference between SNCC and the MLK movement? Did you see any type of similarities or differences between what SNCC was trying to do?
I did have some notes that there was separation even within the civil rights movement. And I thought that was interesting because even though they were aligned on certain things, I mean, just between Malcolm X and MLK, and then what they were bringing up with SNCC, I thought it was really, even though they had the same overall goal, there were different views on how to accomplish that, even within their own movement. So I thought that was really interesting that they were spotlighting all of those different things. Oh, my internet saying that it's unstable, so I'm in a very rural area, so I'm like, it might get sketchy here for a minute.
So in those terms, do you think that the White House picked one or the other because of the militancy or the nonviolence approach that they literally focused to negotiate with King versus dealing with SNCC?
I think it's interesting that even though MLK was really putting pressure on Lyndon Johnson, that it was Wallace that kind of made him flip the switch. Like, MLK is fighting, and then he's just seems so grossed out by George Wallace that he's, using King's words that King used to get, not against him, but towards him. And then when he gets Wallace's response, he's just like, yeah, I'm done. And then that's when the Voting Act gets kind of pushed through. I think that all of the parties involved each played their own part. But I think, and it's really interesting because George Wallace is a really interesting character in himself, because when he first started out in government and when he first ran for governor, he ran, like, one of his mentors was very, I had made some notes because I had listened to a podcast a couple years ago, and then I went back and I re-listened to it. But one of his mentors was this guy named Jim Folsom, and he was very socially progressive for racial equality and voting rights, as well as getting women government jobs. And so when George Wallace ran for governor the first time, he ran on moderate positions in racial equality. And the person he was running against was pro-segregation, and his platform was backed by the KKK. And he ended up winning. And that was when, like, shortly after that is when George Wallace really upped his game and changed his stance. And so and then later in his life, he tried to kind of go back and kind of make amends. And he was saying that it was a misunderstanding of the Constitution and something that was, misunderstood in the Bible. So it was interesting that he went from one stance to complete opposite and then tried to backtrack afterwards. So I thought that was just really interesting that, they really did a really good job with George Wallace, because he's just horrible. But again, it's like typical politician,
right?
Yeah. Doing more so what he thinks the people want.
Yeah, and saying things probably that he doesn't really mean or believe just to get elected, just to be. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, I got the sense that LBJ was trying to let the state take care of it at first, and then that pivotal meeting with Wallace was really the impetus for LBJ to go back and say, "No, forget it. We're kind of done talking here. Let's push it through and let's get the Voting Rights Act in place." And I think, to your point, that single conversation there, as depicted in the movie, was definitely that turning point for LBJ.
Yeah.
I had also made a note about when they were meeting, when MLK's group's meeting, they were talking about tangible tactics and needing a voucher to register to vote, or having someone vouch for you to be able to register to vote. And how can you have that if no one is registered to vote? And they were just kind of talking about the progress of it, but also what MLK was saying is that when he was talking with LBJ, he was saying they can't register to vote, and then they're being, beaten and killed in their attempt to get these rights, and then the people that are, acting violently can't be convicted because the people can't get on a jury because they're not registered to vote. And I thought that was, I understand how that part of the system works, but I'd never really necessarily put that together with the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act. I really honestly take it for granted that I went to the DMV when I was 18 and, do you want to register to vote? Yes. Do you have a preferred party? It wasn't necessarily a big deal. And I didn't even think about how they do the jury selection. So I thought it was really interesting that they called that out in the process of it, just the far-reaching repercussions.
Right. That's funny because that's one of the same scenes that I wrote down about, because I just thought I was kind of along the same lines, like, wow, it's like a vicious cycle. Like they can't do this because of this, and they can't do this because of this, and it's all, and then I thought it was interesting, and it's kind of towards the beginning, I think, but when he's talking to the president, and he's kind of like, okay, just slow down, let's just kind of slow down everything, and let's just put it on the back burner just for now, and let's just, and he's like, no, we need, we can't do that, we need this right now, and he's kind of pushing him, and it just kind of shows that yes, maybe some people did agree with it, but he's like, what can I really do about it? You're telling me what to do, and I can't do that, even if I want to help you. So it's kind of like, I felt like that's how it went a lot, was like, yeah, I think that it's wrong, but what am I going to do about it? Like what, and he's saying, the Blacks need the right to register to vote and vote without being kept from voting, just like you said, like, just like the voting scene in the beginning where, she's turning in her papers, and, he's going to find any reason to decline her, the right to vote. And, I just thought it was like interesting that, it's like, yeah, I do want to help, but I mean, let's just kind of slow down and let's just put this on the back burner. And that's not, that's not what needed to be done. And King was really standing up for that, at least,
So do you think that the Oval Office and white society in general at the time really just distilled it down as to the rights to vote without thinking about the downstream impacts of trial by jury and trial by your peers and not being able to be put on a jury because you're not registered to vote?
I think one of the interesting things is that, just like Laura kind of said, is that okay, sorry, let me gather my thoughts. They like, it doesn't, just like she was saying, like, she really took for granted when, going to the DMV and say, oh yeah, I want to vote. Probably just the same back then is that it didn't affect them. It didn't affect their right to vote. They didn't have that personal struggle. So it was probably harder to relate. And, oh yeah, you don't have the right, you don't have the right to vote, but that's not really, I mean, it didn't really, if they aren't able to put themselves in their shoes, and they will truly never understand their struggles, then I think maybe that was part of it. It was hard to relate. Maybe part of it.
So do you think it's more of a head in the sand? It doesn't impact me, so why care?
I think they were scared of what they could accomplish if they got the vote. And I think when, at the end of the movie, when they're like rolling the scenes, the sheriff, they voted him out right away, and I think that just giving them a voice, I think was the scary part for the Southern residents, just, people who had lived in such segregation, strong segregation, that they were used to it, and it was fueled by hate. I think that it was more the fear of what would actually happen if those citizens were given the right to vote.
Yeah, I was reading somewhere that after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that something in the neighborhood of 185 politicians, mayorships, congressional seats, senators, representatives were voted out of office because of the power of the Black Caucus. And it continued a trend throughout the next 10 years of more Blacks being voted into positions of power and or being replaced by progressives from 1965 to 1975. So do you think that that's part of the reasoning, or do you think that it was such deep-seated, segregated, racist views that really had people taking pause and trying to make it easier for Blacks to vote?
I don't think that even after the Voting Rights Act was passed, that it suddenly was like, okay, come on down, everybody register to vote and, you know, complete your ballot. I mean, I've seen, you know, documentation that will like outline what was on state law books long after it was, you know, and even though this was, the bill was passed, there were still things on, the state law books that prohibited women and you know, different races from voting up until, you know, within my lifetime. You know, I think one of the things I saw was like 1984 in some of these states, and I wasn't sure if it was Alabama or if it was Mississippi, but it was like something in the deep South, and I was like, how is this even still on the books that long?
Yeah.
You know, so it's like, even though it's you know, enacted into law, doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually being upheld.
Yeah, I agree on that. And kind of moving on to the where it says write about the historical details that you learned through the film. And I just think one of the craziest things to me after watching it was just like, it's so shocking that it wasn't that long ago. You know what I mean? Because I feel like learning about it, you know, I feel like I learned about this in school, and like in my mind it's like that was so long ago. Like I can't even imagine that ever being, you know what I mean? Like
You're
in
making me feel old.
in my lifetime, I'm like, oh my gosh, like that, I just can't ever imagine. That's never how it's been in my lifetime. And so just to, you know, 1960s, that wasn't that long ago.
But it is, I mean, it's still going on. Like even in the Atlanta gubernatorial race for 2018, like Brian Kemp versus Stacey Abrams, there was stuff all over the news about people threatening her and how they were never going to have a Black woman be governor. And just, I mean, it was just atrocious, some of the stuff that was coming out from those polls, and voter tampering and stuff like that, or, you know, making it difficult to vote. So I think that that's, you know, it's like, oh, it's so, how can this be how could that happen, and how could it be like that? And then it's like you see these things
still is, yeah,
happening.
I know. That's like the crazy thing to me is I feel like it's so shocking, because I'm like, is this even serious right now? Like, how is this happening? You know, it's just like, I don't know. I think that was the main thing to me. I was like, it's just so shocking. I just felt like,
Yeah, it almost makes you want to think about adopting like an American Idol voting style, right? Grab a cell phone, click a button, and vote for whoever. Because I think I had seen something like season 12 of American Idol had more voters, and obviously you could vote multiple times with the American Idol app, but there were more voters voting for the finals in American Idol than there were voting for the presidential election.
Yeah, I was wondering, how do you guys feel about that after all they went through to get registered to vote? Do you have any kind of opinions or thoughts on people that take that for granted, or, you know, don't participate in the system after everybody went through stuff?
That's a great question. Yes, I feel very strongly with it, because the level of apathy, like even within my own family, my parents, you know, 74 and 82 years old, respectively. My dad, darker skin. My mom from Indiana. My dad's Filipino, but he worked in the fields at the time, so he looked very, very dark. They got married in '63, and they were smack in the middle of it, but they've never voted, ever. So, you know, they've dealt with, and granted, it was in California, you know, mixed race couple, my dad being dark, my mom being light skinned. They should have been in the forefront of it, but the level of apathy just, oh, we're not going to make an impact anyway, so why bother?
Yeah. That's interesting. I feel like a lot of people my age take it for granted a lot, and it's like, well, I've heard a lot of people like, I don't really know that much about it, so I'm just not gonna, you know, I'm not gonna do the research, or I'm not gonna even try to form an opinion so that I can vote. They just, well, I don't know anything about it, so I'm just gonna, I don't, it's like they almost don't even feel, what's the word? Like they should be able to vote because they're not like qualified, you know, like they like, I'm just gonna leave it to everybody else. And it's like, no, it does make a difference, you know, and I don't know.
We have a friend who, our kids have gone to school forever and a day, and they live up the street from us. She's Vietnamese, and she became a citizen 3 years ago. And the recent ballots in the recent election, she literally gave me her ballot and said, here, fill this out for me. I said, hold on for a second. This is why you fought to become a citizen. This is why you came to your country. I'll sit here and I'll explain all the different ballot initiatives to you, but you have to make your own decision. If you don't understand something, I'll help you research it and explain it. But you can't just give up your vote to someone else like it's nothing. It's actually super powerful. So I had to do a little bit of influencing because she really didn't want to go through it, but she was registered to vote and she felt compelled that she needed to vote. But she was just blatantly willing to just flip it over and say, hey, you take care of it.
Yeah.
No. That's where fascism, and that's where, you know, manipulation comes into play. When all of a sudden you're giving up your vote to other people, you know, the masses start to influence negatively.
Yeah, and I think another thing is, if you're gonna take that for granted and you're not gonna vote or take it seriously, then you don't get to complain about anything.
Yeah,
You're not willing to do anything about it.
Participate or be quiet.
Right.
Yeah, I have a coworker, and this coworker is very, very red. We'll just say red versus blue. He's very, very extremely red, and I'm more like a centrist moderate myself. And he's always complaining about, you know, social injustices against, you know, the white race. And I asked him the other day, I was like, hey, so how'd your vote go? Oh, I haven't voted in 20 years. Well, stop complaining, because you have no voice in it if you don't want to do something simple as voting.
Yeah, I agree.
The next section, they're talking about the rhetorical tactics and logical fallacies. And I was doing some research on appeal to authority and thinking about how people's perceptions were at the time and people's beliefs. You know, those beliefs came from generations, and hearing it from the pulpit and hearing it from the media within those areas, just expanding on that. Do you feel that those influences were that appealed to authority? So if the newspaper is saying that so-and-so is, excuse the phrase, a cotton picker Negro, do you think that helped instill the same beliefs that were prominent in the South?
I'm sure it did. I mean, I don't know. Kind of like.
Yeah, because what they talk about in the appeal to authority is where, like, let's say, for example, you had a bad experience with LeBron James, and your experience with LeBron was that LeBron basically said, hey, you know something, Rachel, I don't like you. I don't like the way you dress. I don't like the way you feel. You're gonna come off with a negative perception about LeBron, and you're gonna communicate it to a third party. You now become the authority on LeBron and his behaviors. So going back to that logical fallacy of appeal to authority, if one person misbehaves, and this is kind of the point that I always try to go to with whenever people are talking about racism, is if one person in that sect of people misbehaves. So let's say, for example, you have an African American who is behaving inappropriately, and your experience was a bad experience with them, and you go talk to the third person, does that now make you become the authority and thus influencing everyone's thought on how those people are?
I had a little bit of a different take on it. I was thinking, like, with the Jim Crow laws that were part of the South at that point, I would see that more as the authority, not necessarily, I wasn't necessarily seeing it as a person. I was thinking more of it as an institution. And that being set up for the authority fallacy, I thought that that kind of set the status quo, and then they're trying to kind of come in and upset the, everything. But it seemed really strange because it was like, when I'm watching the movie, when I was watching Selma, I was like really super scared for everyone that was doing the marches and everyone that was participating or trying, I was kind of like, oh my God, don't do it. I'm like, this is so scary. I was very, very scared. But for the police officers and the troopers and everybody else that was kind of coming in, it wasn't like there was any kind of fear represented on that side. It wasn't like they were like they could just come in and do what they wanted. And it wasn't like they were scared that the protesters were going to retaliate. It wasn't. It was, they had the power. They had the ability to just kind of go in and do what they wanted because they were acting under the institution of racism and Jim Crow and segregation. So I wasn't necessarily thinking of it in terms of people. I was thinking it more in an abstract kind of way. But I mean, it's not like, but would there possibly be, like, what was their motivation, like, on the other side? Like, are they like, oh, I guess I have to go to work and I'm scared of what could happen? Or are they like, I've got this? And there's studies that show, like, people put in authoritative roles will have a different mentality for that, and there have been like different experiments with it. So that was really kind of what I was thinking about with the authority. It's like you're challenging authority, and for things that aren't, it's these laws that are put into act in those areas and just taken for granted that they're there.
Yeah, you actually went to where I was taking this, and in terms of that appeal to authority was inbred across the system with everyone. So it's very easy for our followers to say, it is written, thus it must be so. And that's really what it boils down to in that appeal to authority is, it is written, thus it must be so. It's in law, so therefore we must abide to it. And I think that having that documented or implemented, or it gave already weak-minded individuals more power to continue to discriminate against African Americans at the time.
Yeah. Did you guys watch any of the videos that were on appeal to authority?
I did.
I watched a few of them, but the one, it's like what you're saying now, it's the dinosaur one. Did you watch that? I thought it was just funny because it's so, like, What more proof do you need? This is a model of the flat earth, and we have a whole, warehouse full of them. So if you need any more proof than that, and they're all like, it must be true. It's just this kind of, dramatic of that same view.
Yeah, I'm surprised there's still flat earthers today, with everything that's out there.
Because it's like, I don't know if you guys watched the video. It's called The Authority Fallacy Idea Channel, PBS Digital Studios. He's saying like, this doesn't mean that like experts and scientists don't have the authority to, it doesn't mean that their research that they've found to be true is not true. It just means, that if they don't have the authority to say that, you can do your own research. It's not, you don't just take their word for it 100%, but not discounting scientists. So
yeah, experts are experts.
Right. Yeah.
So circling back to SELMA, was there anything that you took away with like a motivational component saying, oh my God, because they fought so hard for X, I'm going to now do Y?
I think, just kind of like we talked about earlier a little bit, I think for me it takes like, and this was just only one of the issues, obviously, but the voting aspect of it, I think for me, it makes me think like, okay, I need to take it a little bit more seriously. And, I do vote, but maybe just motivate me a little bit more to realize, don't take it for granted, and realize how lucky I am to have that. And maybe to do, put some more research into it, and just maybe take it a little bit more seriously just after seeing that.
Yeah, the key for me is when I look at all the political ads that come up around time to vote, is trying to influence folks across my family and friends to actually go do that research, because it's very easy to say, oh, look, Martha McSally is blah, blah, blah because of the attack ads, versus if you go and do some research on Martha McSally, love her or hate her, some of the fake attack ads, I almost said fake news, but some of the fake attack ads were literally taken out of context along the way in that race.
Yeah.
So I'm having a deeper understanding of those issues that we're voting on. It's important for us to make those decisions, and for me, it's even more empowering to now use what I felt and the emotions that came from watching that movie, and using that as an impetus to go out and even try to influence more people to do more research and vote with their heads and not based off of sound bites.
Right. And that goes, you guys have heard all the stuff about Facebook and all the crazy stuff that gets put on there that's definitely not true. And I have a grandma that is on there, and she is just strongly believes one way, and she shares anything that pops up, and I'm like, Grandma, like, did you even read? Did you even research? Because it's like most likely not true, but I think it's just important to not be so stuck in one way that you can't see any other view, or that you can't, or that you see something that aligns with your views, so you just automatically believe it's true, no research, nothing to back it up, and it's usually some wild extreme story, and I'm like, okay, that didn't happen. So
there was a quote about knowing the enemy, or in order to understand, if you know the enemy and know thyself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. And that goes back to, once again, going back to politics, it's, the person that you're going to vote for, but you also know their opponent, and to be able to make your decision. So if it's a toss-up between Biden and Trump, I want to know the details of both, not just because I don't agree with Trump, but I also want to know everything about Biden, even though he hasn't announced he's going to run yet. So
Right.
you need not fear the battle if you know both of them, both sides.
Right. Exactly. Agree with that.
So what else do we have in this worksheet here?
Okay, I think we've covered up to authority.
I have too many things open.
Yeah. I don't think there's necessarily any more like questions that are to be answered. The rest of it is kind of like, I don't know, just.
Did you watch the confirmation bias video by any chance?
I watched the confirmation bias one, yes.
I did not, no.
It's basically saying that it was giving an example of a cable company, and if you ask your friend if there's a cable company, ABC, and then you go online, they're like, oh, they're terrible, go online and look at some of their reviews. Then you go online and you look at the reviews, and sure enough, all you find are complaints. It's just kind of like reconfirming the first information that you've got. But I thought the most interesting part of that video to me was it wasn't only about new information that's being presented, but it's about stuff that you remember as well. So it was something could stand out in your head for, something that was a long time ago, and something could have changed, policy could have changed or perspective could have changed, but you're still favoring and biased towards that original information. So
yeah, you're going to keep that, whether it's good or bad, you're going to tend to remember the good or the bad.
Yeah. It's just confirming what you've already taken in.
And the reason why I brought it up was when thinking of, and it goes back to an example of what just happened to me. I inherited a couple of team members who their performance, their reputation precedes them, we'll just say. And I had heard about their reputation for poor performance 2 years ago. And through mergers of teams and reorganizations, I ended up inheriting them. And over the past few weeks, when I started to get to know them a little bit better and know what their strengths and weaknesses are, they were not leveraged to their strengths. They were literally square peg in a round hole. But I came in with a very strong confirmation bias because I had this preconceived notion. And then there was one or two events that happened to me in my interactions with them personally that kind of confirmed what that bias was. But I had to choose to ignore it and try to figure out a way how I can help develop them. So I actually took the time to understand what made them tick, understand what their talents were, in order to try to dissolve my confirmation bias. So when I saw this on the list, like, let me go take a look and see what they're talking about with confirmation bias. And I didn't realize that my own was so strong against these two individuals, and I hadn't realized the steps that I naturally took towards trying to dissolve that in myself.
Yeah, I think that one of the important things along with that is, I remember from my project management class, we talked a lot about biases, and one of the important things is that everybody has biases, and you're never going to not have them. There's no way to, you're not being honest if you say you don't have biases. But the important thing is, just like what you did, is that you acknowledged them and you understand what they are, and then that way, if you acknowledge them, then that way you're able to work around them, and you're able to understand that you have that, so.
And selfishly, I need people to produce them and need the bench talent. So, when they came underneath my tier in the org chart, I had to try to start with a clean slate and figure it out for myself, even though in the background, I hear things I need to pay attention to. clean slate, clean paper. Let's either go and support what I've heard or prove me otherwise.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you bring up the confirmation bias when we just talked about the authority fallacy, because I think they kind of go hand in hand, because it really makes it easier to have that confirmation bias when you're hearing it from, somebody that you would think is an authority, especially in like an organization type situation.
Yeah.
So if you're hearing that from their former bosses, they've worked with them, they seem like they would be an authority. So then, if any of their behaviors had led you, it would be really easy to pick out behaviors that would substantiate what you heard from somebody that was a previous manager or leader.
And just as simply, it's been proven that, sometimes people leave bad managers, they don't leave bad jobs. So knowing that, is that confirmation bias based off of bad manager or bad employee? And let me clean the slate and let me go figure it out for myself.
Yeah.
Did any of the other fallacies stand out to anybody?
Let's go back up here.
I mean, the ad hominem, you kind of were talking about that with the ads and stuff like that, people attacking the person rather than the argument. I thought that they did a really good job, the video, differentiating the red herring fallacy from straw man, just with, distraction and ignoring the main issue and saying that you won the argument, versus the straw man, which is just kind of, knocking down the argument. I thought that was an interesting video as well.
Yeah.
I've used the straw man approach in trying to understand other people's ideas before. So the straw man fallacy was already somewhat familiar, where you actually try to find reasons why the argument's invalid in order to help establish your understanding of that argument in the first place.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. So it's a good technique in order to try to come up with risks and ways to mitigate the risks. If someone presents an idea, toss all types of stones against that idea, see what breaks. And if nothing breaks, then it's a solid idea. Is basically what the crux of the straw man fallacy is. So surprisingly, I didn't realize what time it was, and we're a few minutes over.
Nice.
Is there anything else that we need to hit or cover before we call this one today?
I just want to double check my notes really quick, just to make sure I had everything. Everything was kind of separated for SELMA, and then the tactics, and and then the unifying vision. No, I think I have everything that I have in my notes. We've kind of...
Yeah, I think me too.
All right. Well, the same process as before. I'll go ahead and post the recording up to YouTube. It gives me the link right away, so I'll send out the link as soon as YouTube gives me the link. And then from there, we'll go ahead and I'll email that out, but it may not launch for another hour and a half or so.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, that'll work.
No worries.
Thank you for your time today.
Thanks for being flexible, guys.
Yeah.
See you next
week.
Yep, see you next week.